based on a true documentary, based on a true story. Let's talk about The Smashing Machine.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are back, the Eye of the Storm podcast. Today, we're here to talk about The Smashing Machine. But before we get into that, it's movie recommendation time, as we do on all of our episodes. So, Daniel, do you want to give the people a recommendation for this week?
So this week I watched Authors Anonymous, which is a 2014 comedy about this writers group of aspiring authors who are trying to make it as an author, get published, and they embody different archetypes of aspiring or amateur writers. So there's somebody who likes the idea of writing but has never read a book, but who gets this surprise book deal. There's the person who thinks he's the next Tom Clancy and thinks he's going to be a great writer any day now. There's somebody who's being enabled by her husband, who's basically paying her away so that she thinks she's a successful author, that sort of thing. And they all kind of have their own journeys and their own issues with writing and their own reasons for not having quite made it. And then one of them gets a surprise book deal that turns into a movie deal and kind of has this runaway success that kind of breaks apart the group with jealousy and envy and resentment. Why did this person make it even though I work so much harder, and all of that? And the story essentially follows these 6 different people who all have their different journeys, essentially. And it's basically a story about ambition and disappointment and rejection and realizing that your dreams are not achievable. And what do you do then? Or just being in denial about it and just trying anyway and just telling yourself that the world is unfair and is not giving you your due and you deserve so much better. And so the different characters are kind of different versions or variations of those themes. It's a very enjoyable movie. It's not amazing, but there's a humanity and a sincerity to the writers, and I think it actually understands its subject matter in the sense that if you are around amateur writers, you will recognize these archetypes and these tropes, and there's something true to them. And if you've ever known somebody who thinks they're much smarter than they really are, or resents the world for not getting the success that they think they deserve and kind of lashes out because of it or sulks because of it, you will recognize that person in this movie. What's funny is that everybody hates this movie except me. So this has like 21% on Rotten Tomatoes. It's like, I think 6% somewhere. It's like everybody seems to think this is complete trash, and it's not high art, but it's watchable and it's fun and it's sincere. And it was a good time. I was not mad having watched it. The story makes sense. The characters make sense. There's a beginning, middle, and end to it. It's a satisfying watch. And I don't quite understand why people hate it that much. But like if you just look at at the ratings and at the scores, it does not deserve those. It should be like a 60% movie or 50% movie instead of 20%. Therefore, that reason I'm recommending it. It's not because it's the best thing I've seen in recent times, but because the enjoyment I got out of it in proportion to its reputation was just so high that I just want to come to the defense of this movie. And if you're interested in that kind of subject matter, you're not going to be disappointed, I don't think.
It'd be interesting to hear why people dislike it so much, like what the actual reason is behind it. Because as you're like describing it, it sounds very interesting. It sounds like a really like human story of you're with a group of people that are on like the same journey as you, pulling in the same direction as you, but what happens when one makes it and then the others don't? And it's like the human reaction out of that. And it seems like it focuses a lot on the character and trying to like, bring to life some of these different archetypes or like some of these different personalities that might react in different ways. So it to me it sounds like a very interesting. I don't know. Maybe it's the case that people just can't relate to it as much because it's like writers and maybe like not many people sort of kind of have been in that situation or can like relate to like being part of a group trying to like achieve something amazing and then like kind of falling short. I'm not sure, but I don't quite understand the 21%. Having not watched it, having just heard your opinion on it, but it sounds like a really interesting watch, at least, to say the least.
And I also adore The New Guy, which has 6% on Rotten Tomatoes, so I'm not gonna completely let my opinions be dictated by like consensus. There's one possibility, which is that it cuts a little bit too close for many people, where maybe people recognize a little bit of themselves. But I don't want to psychoanalyze or anything, but it's more like that could be one of it. There's also janky stuff in this, so it's a mockumentary where there's supposedly a camera crew following around this writers group and just chronicling their journeys, and they just happen to luck into the day when one of them has the big break. and it makes no sense. Like, just ignore it, just pretend it's not there. There's like a few lines where they reference it, and after that, it's just a normal movie. There's also like weird things in there, like there's like the supportive girlfriend who is supposed to be German, but is played by an American actress, and her German accent is so stereotypically bad. It's awful. I can't even describe it. So there's like really cheap and janky stuff in this. But then you've got these characters who feel like people to me, and sometimes that's all you need. So if that topic is at all interesting, I would recommend checking it out.
Cool, cool. I guess on my side, I didn't have too much time to watch too many things, but I did catch the latest episode of Peacemaker. And if it was ever in doubt, or if anyone ever doubted that James Gunn was going to take the DC universe in the right direction and kind of breathe new life into it, Superman, I think, pushed the DC in the right direction. And I think Peacemaker just solidifies that James Gunn knows how to tell these stories, knows how to bring some of these characters to life, and knows how to add, like how to find the balance between, wacky humor and having genuine emotion out of some of these characters. You get a lot of that in the latest episode, where I feel like John Cena, and we're going to talk about like another, wrestler actor in the Smashing Machine once we get to it. But I feel like John Cena has really solidified himself as the best actor to come out of the sort of wrestling universe of everyone that's attempted it. But it was just like it really like got you in your feels like towards the end of the episode, and you can kind of like see some of like Peacemaker's trauma resurfacing at the events are unfolding, and like the flashbacks, and like how that would make him feel, and like how that would almost like put him in panic mode. Just brilliantly acted. It's been a great story. My only complaint is that it's not been long enough. I know it's been like half an hour episodes, maybe 35 minutes, 33 minutes, and it's always a good sign when you're watching a TV show and it's leaving you wanting more. You just kind of want to spend time. Like, I'm going to be really sad when it's actually over. There's one episode left, which comes out this week. But I just want to live in Peacemaker's corner of the DC. But I know whatever comes next in the DC universe will be good, will be great. It's again focused quite heavy on character so far, and building up the right characters, and I have no doubt in James Gunn in executing whatever plan he has for the DC universe. But if you haven't checked it out already, Peacemaker, you should go watch it. It's great.
Do they do actual superhero stuff? Because a lot of the superhero shows, live action specifically, tends to be really light on that and a lot on characters talking about their relationships and feelings, barely using code names, barely using costumes. That like the 2010s live action superhero shows were kind of like this. So is this like this, or is this actually a superhero show?
I mean, he's in this costume. Like, there's definitely a lot of costumes in this. Definitely a lot of costumes. I think there was like one episode where you kind of really see him in action. There's definitely quite a few action set pieces in here as well. I'd say it's like a little bit lighter on more like of the traditional superhero stuff, where he's like trying to save the day, and he's like trying to defeat like a real evil. Because like I don't think there's like a real antagonist in this, but it's more him finding himself and really sort of trying to like analyze himself, and like where he sits, like, and trying, he's like essentially just like wrestling with his identity as Peacemaker, as a superhero who initially, when we're introduced to him in the Suicide Squad, is he's all about peace, and it doesn't matter how many men, women, children that he has to kill to obtain peace. And then it's been like a journey from like season 1 to season 2 of looking a little bit more inwards, probably a little bit less on the traditional superhero stuff, and like antagonists, and like villain of the week stuff, and whatever. And there probably isn't like an overarching villain. At the same time, you do still get a lot of those elements, and he still is in his costume quite a bit, and you do have like other characters in their costumes and stuff like that as well, kicking ass and shooting, blowing stuff up.
Okay, sounds like I might check it out. I'm kind of burnt on those a little bit, but I might take a look at that one. Moving on to the main attraction.
The Smashing Machine. Daniel, do you want to let the people know what this movie is about?
So, The Smashing Machine is the true story of martial artist Mark Kerr, who fought in the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, in the late 90s. He was one of the early pioneers of the sport of mixed martial arts. And this follows his story of his rise as an undefeated champion and his fall into addiction and his attempts to deal with that and his first loss. So, what did we think of The Smashing Machine?
A lot of people are like throwing Oscar like nominations at this movie, or like at Dwayne Johnson, for his acting in this movie. I'm not really one that cares too much about the awards, and I'm not really one that kind of gets in those conversations, but I'm a bit like, I really don't see the appeal. I was very lost immediately. We were kind of like thrown in to like the middle of his story. There wasn't really like a natural like beginning, or like whatever they thought was a natural beginning in this movie wasn't where the movie should have started, because we were kind of just like thrown into this life of Chris Kerr and his girlfriend, and I was a bit like, okay, who are these people? Like, why do I care? And I was just like so confused. And then I feel like the pacing of this is like really off as well. It just kind of like meandered, and it was a bit boring throughout a lot of it. It didn't do what good sports movies are meant to do, which is meant to get you invested or interested in the sport, similar to kind of like what F1 did at the start of the year. I remember coming out of it thinking, yeah, I'm going to be the biggest F1 fan. I haven't watched an F1 race since, or I haven't watched an F1 race at all. But that movie left me sort of like filled with adrenaline, and I just didn't get that from this movie at all. I was kind of like left really thinking, did we need his story? Like, was his story really that interesting that it needed to be made into a movie? I understand his importance to UFC as a pioneer, someone that was like in the early days when things were just kind of getting off the ground, but it didn't really seem like a great story here to be told. I mean, there were pieces of it, such as like him losing his first fight, his like opioid addiction, his conflict with his girlfriend and stuff like that. There's like interesting pieces in there, but they just don't mesh up to make a really interesting movie at all, unfortunately. So I was kind of in there in the cinema, just kind of looking at the clock, thinking, how soon can I come out of this? And like it's always a bad sign when, if I'm watching a movie and like partway through I Google how long the movie is after a certain point, that means I'm not having a good time. That means I'm checking to see how much longer I have to like enjoy this movie. And unfortunately that was what happened here. And yeah, there just wasn't anything really there were like moments, which is really frustrating. There were like moments that were interesting, or like there were like interesting potential conflicts that just didn't land the way I wanted it to. I didn't like this one.
Yeah, I think we're pretty close on this one. I think I'm a little bit more positive on it than you are. First of all, I think it's funny that Emily Blunt is being typecast as the bad girlfriend. After I watched The Fall Guy a couple of days ago, and it's a similar kind of character. That's neither here nor there. I think it is a quite mixed bag where, first of all, it's way too long. Second of all, it lacks focus. It can't decide whether it's a story about addiction or about Mark Kerr as a person or about the history of UFC. And it not only does all of those things at the same time, it also switches between them. And I don't think it harmonizes those parts very well, where one moment it's about one thing and the next moment it's about a different thing, but it doesn't seem to, like, the story connects because it's his life, right? But as a narrative, they seem to be separate. And I found that quite disorienting. I also don't think it's shot in a very interesting way. It's very claustrophobic. Everything is very up close. It's very hectic. Scenes are often very short. And that kind of has the effect of, you feel like you're rushing through it, and it feels like you're always trying to catch up with the movie. And that's just not a comfortable watch. And unless it's done on purpose to create a particular feeling, which I don't think this what was going on here, it's probably not a good choice. There's a few really good emotional scenes in this, especially when it comes to the relationship between Dawn and Mark, which is kind of the center of a good 40% of the movie. That I think is really well done, and the payoff to it is one of the stronger ones I've seen in a while. And I think that is where the talk of Oscar nominations is coming from. But I am on the fence whether that's enough, where you have to sit over a little over 2 hours to get a really good emotional payoff, but for much of it, it's not that interesting. I don't think any of it is outright bad, but it's like a lot of it is just and then, it's like a sequence of events which I think even a biopic needs to do something about. Like it has to have a little bit more of a structure, and this didn't really. And I think there's pretty big gaps in the narrative as well, depending on what you want to make the movie about. And because it's trying to be about at least three different things at the same time, it skips, I think, important things that make the story feel unsatisfying. So let's talk about it.
Yeah, I agree with you. There was like really good emotional scenes in here, but they just like, for me, it just like didn't connect well, as you're saying. To like, one of the scenes I really liked was when he was in the hospital after he passed out from taking too many opioids, and then he had to kind of like go into rehab and recover. But just like that scene of like someone that when his friend's talking to him, you can kind of clearly see that he's in denial about like the situation, and he's kind of like explaining what happened, but in a like roundabout way, and he's like missing important details, and you can kind of just like see that it's someone that isn't ready to accept what something they've gone through. And then the minute his friend just kind of like says, "You got to stop what you're doing," essentially, he just breaks down. I thought that was like a really good emotional scene, but it was just yeah, yeah, like so, like I know I sounded really like down on it, but I feel like I'm like a little bit close to you in that there are good things in there. But yeah, I feel like in these like biopics, there needs to be like this kind of like rise and fall, or like this like fall and rise, or something along the lines where you're on this journey with the character and you feel the emotions, and like when the character's like really down in the dumps, you kind of really feel it, and when they're like on this like really big high, and like you're kind of like rooting for them to like come back out of it. Whereas like I just didn't have that emotional roller coaster in this movie at all.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. His wins come a little bit easy in the beginning, but that's because he was undefeated for so long. So I've not researched Mark Kerr's story. I've not seen anybody outright debunk it. So I'm just going to assume kind of the big ticket items are what happened. And I think his whole story is that it comes so easy to him initially, and then he falls, and then he has a hard time dealing with it. And that was something I could relate to, and that is something that I think works, where this guy is just not used to failing, and so when he fails hard. And one of the big themes of this movie is what happens when you can rely on people, right? Like in various times, he can rely or not rely on people, and that is really the thing that kind of drives his outcome, right? Like in the beginning, Dawn is not really there to support him, and so he falls into this deep depression and eventually opioid addiction. Later on, when she has this big crisis, he's there to help her, and his friend is there to help him, and it all then kind of turns out well, right? Like that's a very high level way of saying in this movie, when people care about you and you can rely on them, that's when good things happen. And that is the main determinant on whether or not there are good outcomes. It's not the hard work, it's not the training, it's not the determination, like all the things that people talk about in the ring. It's about, are there people who have your back? And for a long time, nobody has Mark's back, right? And that is when he fails, and that is when he digs himself out of it again with the help of a friend, right? But that friend is not there initially because he has his own thing going on. So that I think is kind of the core idea that's in this, right? And I think that works quite well. But I think to get to that point, we have to watch and breeze through it for a while. And that's probably not the most interesting thing to watch.
And I think that's like the movie's biggest sin is that there's like these good ideas in there, but it's really painful to kind of get through to actually those good parts. You say like there's like this kind of like theme of relying on people, and how when he didn't have Dawn there, he kind of fell into this opioid addiction, but I don't feel like the movie really set that up well, because we kind of just like jump into the middle of their relationship. We kind of just like jump into she's making this movie, but she gets it wrong because she's like not really 100% paying attention to what he needs and what his diet is. I just kind of felt like a little bit disorientated, kind of jumping into the movie. And I didn't really like understand the whole like opioid addiction side of it, because it just for me anyways, it felt like it came out of nowhere, and it felt like it just kind of like was building, and this was before his first loss. This was kind of something that he was doing anyways, and it was probably like to deal with the pain of like being in the ring, and like the physicality of it and the brutality of it, etc. But I don't know. I kind of felt like we were just trapped into the middle of it, and I didn't really get a sense as to how he reached that stage where he really had the opioid addiction, because he was hiding it around the house as well when he was searching for it.
Yeah, so we don't see the beginnings of his career, right? He's already successful when the movie starts. But I do think it establishes that he's on these painkillers because he's in constant pain because of his injuries. And I don't think we need to get a lot of detail on that. It's obvious that this is going on. And from there, it's easy to go to other opioids like heroin. Although I think the movie does a really poor job explaining that, because the only time we see him inject something is the painkillers. At one point, there's a close up on the label and says opioid, but that's the painkiller, right? Like I did not see any reference to heroin as well, which is what it seems to be. When Dawn says, "Oh, he's leaving his stuff laying around," I thought that meant he has become addicted to these painkillers and he's getting sloppy. And when you're addicted to something, by all accounts I've ever read, you start hiding it because you kind of on some level know something is wrong and you don't want to confront the arguments, and so you start hiding it. And that's kind of the first big sign that something is wrong. We see that this is happening, right? And we see, like, one thing I quite liked about this is how in the beginning both Mark and Dawn are really bad at relationships and really bad communicators. Like, they have this extended argument about the smoothie, and like I'm sitting there in my theater chair saying, do you know what a pen is? Can you write down the recipe? And then she just makes the smoothie according to the recipe. So then they don't have to have an hour-long fight about half a banana or one and a half bananas. But that's me, right? Like, that's how I approach things. Them not being able to do this kind of tells me that both of them are bad at this. And then as the movie goes on, the balance shifts towards Dawn being the unreasonable one, the uncaring one, the selfish one. I think that transition was done quite well because in the beginning, both of them have their mistakes. And then over time, Mark's mistakes kind of fade away and the focus goes onto Dawn's mistakes, and they get more and more egregious. Not trimming the cactus the way he would like while he's in rehab is one thing, right? Okay, she promised it, and it's understandable he's upset with it, but it's ultimately not a big deal. What kind of is a big deal is like casually taking large amounts of pain medication in front of a recovering addict. You know what I mean? Like, that one is a lot more serious. And I think that is kind of where the switch in the audience is flipped, where say, okay, this is not just being a little bit careless or Mark being a little bit extra about how he wants things. Like, this is actually a problem. And from that point on, Dawn like keeps getting worse and worse.
Actually, I thought like the whole arguments that they had was actually really well done in a sense, and like in terms of like how nuanced it was. Of like you said at the start, it wasn't really like necessarily like. I think by the end of it, you kind of like feel like Dawn's in the wrong, but like at the start of it, it's quite nuanced in the sense that you kind of understand it from like both of their perspective, in the sense that something's important to that one person, but it's like almost not as important to the other person because like they have their own things going on and they're kind of like both guilty of not really like I'm trying to find the right word, not really like kind of like compromising on, you know, their values and like kind of like what they value and giving enough time to the other person essentially, if you kind of like catch my drift. But they're kind of like both guilty of focusing too much on what they need. And then, you know, it's quite interesting how they portrayed Dawn's character as someone that needed to fix or needed someone to depend on them for her to like have some sense of worth in the relationship is, or importance in the relationship, is that he comes to her, like she helps him through his stuff, and like the fact that he's like going to all these other people like makes her feel like a little more worthless and stuff like that. So a lot of like the relationship dynamics, a lot of like the arguments, a lot of like how they were bickering and like, you know, the topics of it and like, you know, how they handled their conflicts and stuff like that. When you said about like the smoothie thing, it seems like it's just a smoothie, but you can imagine like it's probably happened a few times, or he said it a number of times, and to him it's like super important for him to get like the right nutrition all the time. But to her it's like a bit of a throwaway. It's a bit like, oh, like he just kind of wants like this, but then she then goes away and focuses on whatever she needs, because his world isn't necessarily her world, and they just kind of haven't figured out a way to like merge their two worlds together in the right way where they're the right things for each other. All to say that the relationship dynamics of it was actually done really, really well.
One of the things this movie does is that it shows us each thing once, right? So we don't see them arguing over the smoothie several times. It happens once, and so we cannot judge what has come before, right? We don't know how clear he was and whether he's right that he told her one thing and then she did the smoothie in a different way, right? Like, he might have given her the wrong recipe or forgotten to tell her that it now needs to be this instead of that. I was sitting in the theater. I was sitting next to these two women who I didn't know, right? Just random strangers, and they were very clearly on Dawn's side in the beginning. Like, every time she like argued back to him, they were like, "Yeah, tell him," right? And then as the movie went on, they got increasingly uncomfortable, and they increasingly found it harder to take Dawn's side. And then they were very quiet towards the end, which is kind of funny. Like, they couldn't quite get to the part where they said, "Yeah, Mark's definitely in the right on this," but like maybe threatening to kill yourself twice within 2 minutes is not a healthy approach to relationships. Like, they wouldn't go that far, but yeah, I could sense an evolution in their reaction to Dawn, which to me kind of tells me that the movie was doing something right. Because if somebody really wants to be on her side and the movie is making it harder and harder, but it's not like you don't like nobody called bullshit on it. Nobody said, "Oh, this is just nonsense," or "This is just leaning on the scales too much." To me, that's a sign that this is doing the right thing. One other thing is, I'm not entirely sure about this thing where you said she wants somebody to depend on her, because I have kind of the opposite feeling, because she's around when he's winning and she disappears when he loses. It's a very consistent pattern. She's there when he's winning. When he's in Japan, she flies to Japan to kind of be there for his win and for the glamour of traveling to Japan and all of that. When he is focused on himself because he's about to prepare himself for the fight, she is really upset about it, and both of them snap at each other. And I think that's the first big fight we see. Might be the second one, but it's an early one. And then when he starts losing, the things start getting south very quickly, and then she disappears for a while after she goes into rehab. Like, we don't see him visit her, for instance, or something like that, right? She just disappears from the narrative. And then when he starts winning again, that's when she shows up again and makes this gesture about the bowl and making amends and all of that. I think I've got the chronology a little bit backwards, but like there's this very clear pattern of she wants to be around when he's winning. She doesn't want to be around for the difficult parts. And I think that is really the defining character trait.
But there was that moment where, again, when he's talking to his sponsor from rehab after she's tried to take the pain meds in front of him, and she's been like quite inconsiderate in that particular moment where she's saying to him like, you don't need to speak to him, like you could speak to me, even when she's having a conversation with her friend when she's out for dinner or lunch or wherever they were at, where she's saying, like, she was like explicitly saying this. I don't know if you remember those scenes, but she was kind of explicitly saying he doesn't rely on me, or he isn't coming to me with these things anymore, and he's like speaking to like this guy, and like, why are you speaking to your friends instead of me? That is like a thing. There is like this like theory, and I don't know it like 100% off the top of my head, about there's like certain like roles you kind of play in like relationships, which is why I kind of like recognized it in this particular movie. But I don't know. I felt like it was like explicitly said that she was like wanting him to like depend on her a little bit more, and I kind of like feel like that's why, like, do you know when he was like training for like his big fight in Japan, he was getting ready for that, why she kind of was like, trying to take him like out for drinks and stuff like that, because he was like very focused on the fight, very focused with his trainer and stuff like that. But she kind of felt like she was losing control of him a little bit. It seemed like in the movie, or not control, but losing his attention, and was like trying to do what she can to try and like, win it back.
The through line here is that she wants him to pay attention to her. If he's paying attention to somebody else, that's a threat.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't want to just spend the entire hour just dunking on Dawn. I think 20 minutes is enough of that, which kind of leads into another topic, which is that this is not a fictional story. This is a biopic that is very close to a documentary from about 20 years ago, I think 2002, which I've not seen, but it's worth noting that we are getting one person's version of the story. And there's a reason why he's telling the story, which is he's selling his life story, right? So I think it's worth noting that everything we know about Dawn comes from Mark. Everything we know about Mark comes from Mark. So I think that is just, if we're just evaluating this as a real story, I think there's a reason why it's so one-sided, and that is because that is the story he's telling. And this is like 15 years after they got divorced again. Like, I don't know if she was consulted on this, if they ever got her side of the story, but that's just one thing that's kind of noticeable, that it's quite one-sided. That it's all very, like, the characterizations are all very clear. There's not a lot of dimensions to these characters. Any flaw Mark has makes him more noble, right? If he's a little bit for pushover, it's because he's so caring. And if he is a bad communicator, it's because he means so well. You know what I mean?
I was quite wary of him, and I know they did show him towards the end of the movie as well, in the
Worst
store
scene of the
of like.
movie.
Yeah, I was a bit confused as to why that was like tagged in there. I don't know whether it was like tagged in there to kind of show like The Rock had done a really good impersonation of him, or impression of him, or whether that was like on his side to kind of solidify that he is this like genuinely like nice person. But I don't know. I was like wary the whole time of just like how nice he was to everything and everyone, and I'm very much aware of this, of like how like biopics are told from like certain people's perspectives and point of views, and yeah, I kind of like left it feeling like there's probably like especially like the conflict between like him and Dawn, where he's not really shown to be the bad guy. I kind of feel like it was probably a lot more turbulent than what we were probably shown. And even though what we were shown was bad, I think it kind of felt like it was a lot more turbulent, is what I felt, and that there was like a lot of wrongs done on both sides, to kind of give Dawn some slack in this.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. Like, we are referring to the portrayal as a fictional character in this movie, right? When we talk about what an awful person she is, we don't know her side of the story, and it's not clear that there's another side, but there very well could be. Like that last scene is, I think, is very indicative of the major flaw of this movie, which is if this story is about his rise and fall as a person, and his fall into addiction and his recovery and coming out as a better person on the other side, the ending has nothing to do with that. Like he's just in the supermarket being nice to people, right? And then he drives away. There's literally nothing going on. It makes no statement other than he's okay. Like 15 years later, 20 years later, he's okay. You know what I mean? Like he did not die, like in the ring or something like that. Like it gives us that kind of closure. But like as a person, it's just look at what a nice person this is, and then he's smiling and he's nice to everybody, and he chats with the cashier and all of that. Like it's a very fluffy scene that also has nothing to do with the theme of redemption and coming out the other side better and stuff like that.
And again, like that kind of ties back to, and not to kind of like hammer the point down, and we can kind of like move on to something else after this. But it just kind of ties back to like my feeling of like that like that scene kind of represents the whole movie for me. Where what was the point is kind of what I was like left feeling from all of it. It was like, what was the point? Like I didn't really kind of like get what the movie was trying to sort of deliver. But I know you're not the biggest fan of biopics as a whole, but you seem to be a little bit sort of more positive on this one, despite sort of obviously like some of the flaws that we talked about. What were your reasons for being or leaving the cinema a little bit more like, I wouldn't say you'd like super happy with the movie, but like a lot more positive than kind of what I thought you would be?
I was not that angry, is kind of my bottom line. I think I just like the redemption arc. I think it's a really well done thing. And if it had been focused on that entirely, and we didn't get this weird epilogue about, oh, the UFC was this, like Mark Kerr was this pioneer, and today the wrestlers or the fighters earn millions, and he didn't earn millions, and we know their names, but we don't know Mark Kerr's name, even though a movie and a documentary have been made about him. So, excuse me, we do know his name. So, but like this whole thing just feels very hollow and fake because of that. We're not seeing biopics of the current fighters, right, who are earning so much more money, right? We're seeing a biopic about him, and also it's not connected to the rest of the story. The rest of the story has not really been about UFC as a sport, right? Like there's a little there's tidbits here and there, right? We talk a little bit about how it's big in Japan and not in the US, and people are trying to ban it in the US, and there's this sanitation process where they keep banning dangerous moves, and it's taking kind of the fun and the spirit out of the sport, according to the pioneers who were attracted to that sport because of those things, probably because this was like, and I'm not into wrestling, I'm not into martial arts, I'm not saying this is a fan of UFC, but I kind of remember it from like 20 years ago when I think some friends were into it, and the appeal was this is anything goes, this is like real fighting, this is no holds barred, like people really get injured, like this was the appeal, right? This was the real stuff. And so it getting sanitized over time kind of goes against that spirit, and I can see how somebody who got into it early would have a problem with that, or would see that as a downgrade. But that's not been what the movie was about, right? And then we get this epilogue about how, like, about this like the sport about and how it's changed. It's like, why do I care? I just witnessed a pretty good redemption story about somebody who crawled himself back from rock bottom, more or less. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. Why are you telling me about how much UFC fighters make now? What's that got to do with anything?
Those were Daniel's positive thoughts on the movie, which was the question. Yeah.
I kind of got sidetracked there a little bit. The other half of my answer was I like it because of the redemption story, and then we get other stuff too, which is not nearly as good. Is kind of my answer.
And to kind of like touch on the UFC aspect of it, because obviously we kind of talked about like, the comparisons between, the pioneers and how much money they make today and like, who was there first and stuff. For me, like the most interesting part of the UFC aspect of it was kind of seeing like how things were like changing. Like, as you mentioned about, like moves being banned and like how they were like just kind of like starting to kind of like shape what the UFC was. And I was actually quite interested in that particular story. But then I kind of was like left wanting by the in-ring stuff. It was kind of like both brutal but also boring at the same time. It just kind of didn't have any like real flavor or flair that some of these like combat movies might have, like a Creed or something like that, where kind of like seeing someone get like kneed in the head and punched in the face is like quite brutal. And I'm like not a UFC person, so I kind of cringe at that stuff naturally. But at the same time, it just didn't have like that in-ring storytelling that some of these, really good sort of boxing movies have, for example, which is kind of like the ones that I mainly watch. Even some like the some like wrestling like movies that we watch. I think like the Iron Claw, I actually quite enjoyed some of the in ring stuff, even though there wasn't kind of like too much in there. But I don't know. I just don't feel like they really built up like and this is kind of like the kind of like general theme with why I don't like the movies. I just don't really feel like they like built up to be this spectacle or like this like big thing that you kind of like must watch. And it's like it's dubbed as these like ancient mixed martial arts that have been sort of around for thousands of years, all coming together to kind of compete to see which one's the best. And I'm like, that is very interesting. That is really cool. That's like a very cool idea. But then the execution of it just wasn't great in this movie.
Yeah, I think there's this mystique about mixed martial arts, about how all the traditions come together and we see who wins. Like that, like even as somebody who does not care about martial arts, like the idea is kind of cool. But the fights seem to be a bit lame in the first place. Like I watched some of Mark Kerr's fights, like on YouTube, like the real ones from the 90s. They don't see like they're not that interesting to watch. Like obviously in a movie it's gonna be more choreographed and all of that. But I don't know. I honestly did not find the fights all that exciting. And in that sense, the fights in this movie kind of looked fairly realistic. Like they seem to be a little bit heightened, but they do seem to play out more or less the way the real UFC fights do. Like I say this as somebody who has done minutes of research on this, right? Like just watching some of the highlights, but it kind of had a similar vibe.
Is it maybe an issue that they had like real fights? Because obviously they had Alexander Usyk, and I watch boxing, so I know Alexander Usyk in this movie. But then Mark Kerr's best friend in this is an actual UFC fighter, if I read that correctly. So is it a case where they had maybe too many like actual experts in this, and maybe not enough creative people to be like, okay, how can we make this more of a spectacle? And I don't know, maybe it was like a case where they kind of wanted like a true representation or true reflection of what it's like to be in a ring. Because like to them it's like probably sacred and they like really care about it. But you kind of have to understand how that translates to a movie audience who's watching it, and who you kind of have to fool a little bit into believing that this is the greatest thing. It's like, it's like when they say in football, like, a particular match is an advert for the Premier League, for example, where you've got a game which is like 5-3 or like 5-4, something along the lines, where most weeks you'll probably find a bog standard like 1-0, 2-1 game where it's like, quite dull for like large parts of it, and like, teams are like quite defensive, and it's not really this like swashbuckling back and forth game where like one team attacks, the other team attacks, etc. It just kind of felt like they needed someone on the creative side as opposed to like real fighters to be like, okay, this is what you guys do in the ring. How do I make it more exciting? Like again, like in Creed, they don't trade blows in real life. It's not like, you punch, I punch, we just both get hit in the face 1,000 times and, we're fighting and like we're fine. And by the end of it, one of us wins. It's like that in a movie because it's exciting and it's like the element of the fight that most people actually really enjoy.
I did not go into this expecting to be wowed by the fights in the first place. And so them being a little bit grounded is not a problem for me. And also the number one thing I want out of biopics is authenticity. And so if the fights look more real, and I don't can't really judge if to what extent they are, but if they're not, they don't are not hyper stylized, right? If they had done what you're asking for, I think that would have undermined the authenticity of the movie, which is supposed to be the real thing, and the real fights are not like watching a kung fu movie, right? Like there's no big flips, there's no huge choreography. Kind of people like real fights are over fairly quickly, right? Like one person gets the upper hand and it's over very quickly. I don't know. Like that part didn't really bother me, and the reason it didn't was that each of those fights is about Mark's reaction to it, like his emotional state before, during, and after the fight, what he anticipates from the fight and why it's important to him, and his reaction to the outcome, either winning or losing, right? Because to me, that is what that's all about. And the fact that the fights are kind of over quickly and by themselves not that spectacular does not undermine that, because I still understand he lost, he won, and these are the ramifications for him as a person and for his career.
I get that where the movie is kind of more focused on Mark Kerr and like his journey and like you said, like his redemption arc. But it just kind of seemed like there was like this element of also telling the story of like UFC and kind of like where it came from under a different creative team. Maybe like that would have been a little bit more of the focus. Like I think that's just like maybe like on my side where I just kind of didn't connect with Mark Kerr's story. So I'm like looking for other elements of the movie to kind of be a little bit more impressed by. But
I think if you're not on board with Mark's story, there's nothing to the movie. The parts about the UFC itself is very bare bones. I would absolutely watch a movie about the history of the UFC, and the money and the politics and the sports of it. Like I think I could get into that, but that's not what this movie is, right? This is very much the rise and fall of one man.
and I was gonna say you kind of touched on his emotional state before, during, after the fight. You're very big on how movies end. What did you think of like that kind of like juxtaposition between Mark Kerr and his best friend, one that had just like won the title, and then Mark Kerr who had lost, but I don't know, seemed to be smiling and like laughing in the shower and like some type of like euphoric state or whatever. Like what was your kind of like reading of that scene, and did that work for you?
I think that part really worked because his mental state is all about losing, right? Like say in the beginning, he dreads losing because he doesn't know how he's going to handle it. When he's asked by a journalist, "What would you do if you lost?" He's completely blank. Like he has no idea what to answer. It has never occurred to him. It is outside his lived experience. And then he finally loses and he completely crashes. And then he slowly builds himself up again, and then he loses and he's okay with it. The way you show a change in a character is you put the character into the same situation twice and you have them react differently. The first time he loses, it destroys him. The second time he loses, it's a relief. Because now all the pressure is gone. Now he can just be happy for his friend. He would have preferred to have won, obviously, but the reason he's laughing in the shower is it's over. The pressure is gone. He now has clarity. He knows he's the second best in the sport, and his best friend is the best. That's not a bad place to be. I think that is his mental state at the end.
And then you kind of, because like obviously they kind of like did back and forth from the side by side between like him and his best friend in this. Like, how did you kind of read him in that particular moment? Because it kind of like made a concerted effort to actually show the different mind states between the two of them. One that had just lost and one that had finally like realized his dream of winning, and then it was almost like an empty feeling that he kind of felt. And again, it kind of ties back to him not having anyone around him after his like big win, after his like big moment. And it was also like kind of like dubbed as someone that had been on a bit of a losing streak as well. And he kind of like eventually reached the pinnacle and like reached the top, and he had like no one around him, and he was just kind of like sat there contemplating and like reflecting a little bit, and like not as jubilant as you'd probably imagine you would be once you actually finally achieved what you wanted to achieve. But I don't know, how did you kind of like take that in comparison to Mark Kerr?
It speaks to kind of the groundedness of this, that this is not about the big spectacle. He's not heading straight into a big party. He's just sitting there in his locker room, processing the fact that he has achieved what he's worked for however many years. And I think that kind of works to me because honestly, I've been in situations where I accomplished something and there wasn't any champagne. I was just in a room, happy and trying to think, okay, is this real? Like, and how am I supposed to feel? And it doesn't look like in a movie. You kind of just sit there and it lasts a while and then you move on to something else and it fades away. I don't know, that felt real to me.
I don't know. I kind of read it like he was not happy in that particular scene. I don't know whether I kind of like watched it wrong. It was almost like you kind of like mentioned a good point about like Mark Kerr's like character releasing the burden and kind of like releasing the weight of like the pressure he had on himself. On the flip side, he looked like someone that almost had like the weight of the world being placed on his shoulder by winning that championship. I don't know. Maybe I kind of like read it wrong or like didn't see it the same, but I don't know. It kind of felt like he was like down in that particular scene.
I think it's relief for both of them because the pressure has got to be enormous. They react to it a little bit differently because Coleman, they're both kind of similar, right? Like and like in terms of their mentality and in terms of like the skill level and how serious they take the sport, right? They're pretty similar. But what Coleman has over Kerr is that Coleman is a lot healthier. He has his family, he has a support network. Again, the theme of what happens when you can rely on people. Like he's got a family that both he needs to support, but also that he will come back to. Like once the tournament is over, there's a family at home that he can come back to. Therefore, his reaction to winning or to the contest being over is less extreme than Kerr's. For him, it's less about winning and more about proving to himself that he can fight and he can come back, and now that he has lost and it's not destroyed him, and he feels okay about it, that is victory by itself. Because that is victory over his former self. And so they are very similar in some areas and very different in others. And I think their reaction to it, which is silent, alone, in a room, there's nobody else around in both cases, But in both cases, we're getting two different versions of relief of having arrived at what you were dreading. And you come out the other side and it's fine.
Fair.
One thing I kind of did realize as I was kind of reading up a little bit about this is that there's a 2002 documentary, right? I think with the same title. And I saw some clips from it. And this seems like an almost shot for shot recreation of the documentary, down to the smallest detail, right? Just as a couple of examples, when they're in the garden, in the movie, he cuts a cactus, and in the documentary, some kind of other garden plant. And Dawn keeps handing him the knife wrong, right? Like there's a way you hand people knives, which is with the handle first so that you don't stab them. And he does it, but Dawn doesn't. She hands it blade first. And it's like a small detail, but that is actually in the documentary. Like this was not like a symbol. That is actually what happened. And then he's kind of annoyed and frustrated, and he goes catch the leaves out of the pool as she looks around a little bit annoyed that she has to deal with his nonsense. It is shot for shot in many cases. Like anything that's not completely private seems to be directly lifted from the documentary, including a lot of the dialogue.
And it's actually the people. Okay. So did they have like camera crews following them around, or like for the time anyways? It seems weird that they had like camera crews kind of like set up and like following them around and stuff.
So I've not seen the whole thing. I've not researched this in detail, but this was 2 years after the big fight. So my theory is that he had just lost the big fight, and so somebody said, "Hey, can we make a documentary about you?" At this point, he's still fighting, he's still with Dawn, right? I think so. Can we just follow you around for a bit? And then a lot of the scenes that they filmed that made it into this documentary were then adapted into the movie. And there's another one too, like the scene when he's in the hospital and he's lost his front teeth and he's having a breakdown, almost identical to what's in the documentary. So there's a few different questions here, which is number one, is Mark Kerr all that interesting? Is this the best person to make a documentary about if you want to learn about UFC? Or as a person, is he all that interesting? Number two, how come you're doing two movies about him? Number three, how come one of them is a remake of the first?
I mean, my conclusion at the end of it was that he wasn't that much of an interesting person to actually make a full movie out of. It's especially of like the other biopics that I've watched. I just didn't walk away feeling like, oh, I really needed to know Mark Kerr's story. Two, it's a little bit cheap to kind of like lift everything from the documentary. I know they've kind of like done the hard work for you, and I guess it's maybe like brownie points for it. It does work in the sense that I hadn't seen the documentary, so it's kind of me seeing some of these things for the first time. And I guess like if you then do further research then like you did, actually he was this type of person. Maybe it's like a reinforcement of like Mark Kerr is who he says he was in this particular biopic, potentially anyways. I wouldn't say it's lazy. I was going to call it lazy. I wouldn't say it's lazy. I think it just kind of like enriches the experience of trying to go and research. I'm kind of going back and forth with this now, but you kind of like go back and you're like, oh, let me find out more about Mark Kerr. And you're essentially just rewatching the same movie that you've just watched because it's all lifted, not all, but like a lot of it's lifted from the documentary. I'm kind of 50-50 on that, to be honest. I kind of like sit on the fence with it where I see the benefits of it, but I also see how like annoying and like how, like I feel like I would be annoyed that if I did some research and I was like, I've just watched this in the movie, why am I watching this again? Like I kind of want to know more. Does it at least like provide additional context or like not context, but does it like at least like have like additional information where you kind of walk away from seeing those scenes in the documentary and you're like, oh, like, this was like slightly different and like, oh, it makes me like kind of like rethink like how I watched it in the movie at all? Or is it just, it's the same thing?
So in the clips I've seen, it's exactly the same thing. And it may be that they picked those clips precisely because they are so similar. To me, what's interesting about all of this is like his personal journey. And that one, I think, is worth making a movie about. Not sure you need to make two movies about it. It's probably not the definitive story of the UFC. And I don't know who else, like, I don't know the sport, so I don't know if there's somebody else who's more interesting. Could you have made this about Coleman? I'm not sure. He's the champion in the end, but he doesn't have this big redemption arc. Like, his career seems to be pretty smooth. Like, he has the occasional loss, but he does not have this big crisis or these big personal demons. So as a character focused story, I think it's a totally fine story. I think that is why people are talking about Oscar nominations, because I actually think he like Dwayne Johnson does bring Mark Kerr to life. Like if you put them next to each other, it's decently close. Like he tries to look like him as much as possible, and a lot of the mannerisms are pretty close from what I've seen. So this basically is an exercise in trying to be authentic as possible about this. And I can't bring myself to be mad about this because I'm always asking for that. My thing about biopics is I want to see what happened. Like I want you to tell me this person's story. And if you're lying about who this person was to a substantial degree, I'm going to be upset about that. And I'm going to take that personally. And then I'm going to view that as an attack on me. And so it's kind of a little bit weird that I'm so underwhelmed by this movie, but at the same time, it's kind of doing what I always ask for. And there's a bit of a weird sensation.
That's why they say you have to give the people what they don't know they want, essentially. And I know what you don't want is the typical biopic stories that we normally get, and I don't think that would be your flavor. But I don't know. I feel like they could have maybe reinvented it in some type of way where you didn't know you wanted it. And I'm trying to think of a way that they could have done it. And I don't think I've seen it a biopic recently enough to kind of pull anything out. But it's funny that you say that. I don't know if you've had that sensation with any other biopics before, where it's done what you've asked for, and you're like, this is not quite a good experience or a good viewing
Not
experience.
like this. Yeah, it's weird. I think it's mostly because I'm getting a creepy vibe from Mark Kerr. Though just the degree to which he's portrayed as a saint and how squeaky clean he comes across when he appears as himself. Like there's something off about this guy. And I can't point to it. It's more like I have a feeling like I'm being lied to and I can't prove it. And that's unnerving.
That's the other part where I kind of feel like, again, we're chucked into his story just randomly in the middle of it, because again, I kind of get the same feeling of a bit of uneasiness from him. But it even seems like when he's in the hospital waiting area or something, and he's explaining what UFC is to the old lady, and whilst he says some interesting stuff in there, it kind of comes off a little bit weird, and how overly nice he is, and how how much time it takes to kind of really explain what it is. But by the end of it, you kind of understand that it's because he's passionate about it, and it's because he really cares about the sport and what he does. But when it's that early in the movie, and it's one of the first things you're kind of confronted with, I'm gonna be you're being a bit weird, especially us in the UK as well. We have set cultural ways where you kind of don't really say too much, especially on public transport, waiting areas and stuff like that. You kind of don't really interact with other people. You kind of
If
just sit.
only.
I mean,
If only. You've been to Japan recently, right? Did you take the train there or like a I don't know, bus or something?
a few times I took a bus in Japan and I accidentally spilled coffee, and because of how tidy and pristine everything was, I took tissue out, I got on the floor, and I cleaned it up. I was like, I don't even want to be, I don't want to be classed as that tourist. I said, let me wipe up the coffee that I spilled.
Did you
Not
get
even much.
looks?
No, I didn't get looks actually. I didn't get looks. I think I had the baby with me. Everyone was distracted by the baby, cute baby. Everyone was obsessed with it. So I had a little bit of a pass in that sense.
Okay. And also, I've only been to Japan once on holiday many years ago, and my experience was if you try, people will cut you slack. It's when you don't try that's when they don't like it. But the reason I bring up Japan is because Japan has this reputation for everybody is hyper quiet and well behaved in public, and that was kind of the other extreme of always being on and always being loud and always broadcasting everything. Like I think which is what you were getting at.
Yeah, exactly. I kind of feel I lost my point, to be honest. Anyways, but yeah,
It's
pretty
it's
much.
it's fine. It's late.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
One aspect I wanted to add to that is in the beginning, I kind of assumed or believed that he is that because of how big he is and how strong he is, he knows that he intimidates people. So he's always hyper polite. Like every time he fights with Dawn, he's totally under control. Right? He never raises, his hand against her, against anything. He smashes through the door once. And that is when he's pushed really far. So he's constantly aware of how he comes across to people, and he does everything he can to not be intimidating. When there's this Japanese doctor after the fight who won't give him the Advil, right? The pain medication, and he's just really locked down emotionally, where he just is hyper polite when he's talking to a lady in the waiting room, hyper polite, and I for much of it, I kind of took it as he goes through life trying to not scare people because that only causes problems to him. And I don't think there's anything in the movie to suggest that this is on purpose. It's more like in general, people who look like him tend to approach it that way unless they want to intimidate people.
Yeah, you can look at it that way as well.
But then
I
it
mean,
kind of just keeps going, and he just keeps getting more and more polite and more flawless. And then the real Mark Kerr shows up, and he's kind of the same way. I don't know. Part of this is cultural differences. I met an American the other day, just in public, and she was so polite and so outgoing. Like I thought like I thought something was up with her. It's like no honest person is this polite. Like she's got to be up to something. It probably wasn't, but like that's like this stuff is just very relative.
Always be wary of people that are too nice. That's my thing.
Any final thoughts on the Smashing Machine?
I don't even think I'm happy. Do you know, like, some again, like, I think you guys described it with the Long Walk, where like you're happy you saw it one time, you probably won't rewatch it. I can't even say that I'm happy I watched this one. I didn't have high hopes kind of going into it, and it fell below those expectations just because I didn't get that emotional attachment and I actually, like, I'm kind of like normally a bit of a sucker for like some of these like biopics and some of these like, true stories about like certain characters, because you kind of want to be motivated, you kind of want to like, seek some type of inspiration in some of these things sometimes, where you kind of like see someone that's like persevered or like come through like tough background or tough beginnings to like, really achieve and stuff like that. And I don't know, it just didn't. None of it hit for me. Like I wasn't along for the journey at all. Unfortunately, it just felt like really boring, kind of meandered in certain places, and not to like completely trash it, because there are good elements of it, and I think like certain aspects of it they do well. Like, the whole like dynamic between Mark and Dawn is really well done. Some of the emotional scenes are quite well done as well, but just kind of overall, yeah, you're just kind of like left wanting a little bit, is what I'd say. Saying all that, I give it a 4.5 out of 10. Okay, is what I'd rank it.
I don't care about biopics at all. Like they trigger my fight or flight response because of how rarely they are actually honest. And this one is kind of going to a similar direction, where on the one hand it seems to be really close to the documentary, but I'm just getting some vibes of this guy where there must be more to the story. I think the personal journey, like the emotional journey of hitting rock bottom, building yourself back together, and then being a better person on the other side, I think that really works. I don't think this is Oscar material. I don't think this is an amazing movie. This might rank in my, like, probably doesn't crack the top 10 for me this year. It's maybe in the high 20, like in the high teens, like 12, 13, somewhere around there. Good, not great. And I think people are kind of either dismissing it or celebrating it a little bit too strongly. I think it's just okay, just pretty good. As a movie, it's got serious structure and pacing flaws that I just can't get over. Like there's like a 40% in there of the movie that is really quite good. And then the other 60% are kind of dragging it down. And that is not a good balance. Like every movie is gonna have slow pieces. This just has way too many of them. And so for that reason, this is like a 5 out of 8, something like this. I'm not mad I watched it. I don't think I'll ever watch it again. I don't think I'll recommend it. I kind of want to know a little bit more about Mark Kerr as a person and whether my weird vibes, or whether he just has a really good agent that gets him deals that portray him in a positive light. I'm a little bit curious about that, but just as a story, it's not that interesting. I actually kind of walked away from this wanting to know a little bit more about the UFC, just its history and how it compares to other sports. Still not interested in watching it, but I wasn't before, so that's no loss. So it's kind of a mixed bag.
With that, we've come to the end of the episode. As always, if you reach this part of the episode, we appreciate your support. We appreciate you pressing play on this episode and any other episodes you might have checked out from us. As always, if you liked what you heard today and you enjoyed our discussion, you should probably tell a friend. And if you hated everything and you thought we were chatting a bunch of nonsense, you should probably tell an enemy. We are the Eye of the Storm podcast.
Bye bye.
See you later.